Thanks so much for joining us today. I am again Shelley Gehring with MHP, and I'm here with my colleague Emma McGurran, who is going to be supporting us in this session today. So, we are part of the community assistance team at MHP, and we're holding a 3-week conference for housing trusts, affordable housing trust funds, and for community preservation at communities or CPCs. And last week we focused on the role of trusts and of CPCs and some suggestions for working together. Today, we're going to be focusing on establishing goals and strategies for your affordable housing trust fund. Please feel free to be putting comments and questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and bringing those to the speakers. We're going to hear from 2 communities today, Amherst and Marshfield, who have spent the last several months of the last year really digging into their housing needs and establishing, identifying specific goals and some strategies for their trust to be working towards in the next few years. The reason why we encourage trust to take the time to do this is because while many communities have an affordable housing or like housing production plan or a needs analysis, oftentimes the goals in those plans are really broad. And they're not just for the trust, they're community goals. And so we are really encouraging trust to spend some time digging into the plans that you have and really making those goals measurable. So, smart goals, focusing them a little bit, and then coming up with some strategies to help guide the work. And then also some sort of implementation strategy to how to move forward on that. So, we've worked with Marshfield and Amherst in the last year. And we've invited both of those communities to come and to share some of their process, what they've learned, what worked for them, and how they're planning on moving forward. So we're starting with Amherst. And again, please put your comments and questions in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Greg Rashane, who is the Associate Planner and Housing Coordinator for Amherst. Greg.
Thanks so much, Shelley, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit today, and thanks everybody else for joining us. I got a few slides, but let's note again, I'm Greg, and I'm here in the town of Amherst, Mass, out in the Connecticut River Valley, out in college country. I will also note that I'm a relative newbie to municipal work, though I have a longer background in housing advocacy. So I'm both kind of hopelessly naive, but I also have some fresh eyes. So that's kind of how I came at this whole process. With that, maybe I'll just share a bit of background on how we worked with Shelley. Let me just share my screen here. So I will note, just to start, that our planning and goal making process really benefited incredibly from our work with Shelley and MHP, and sort of the institutional knowledge that she brought to this process, which was obviously quite helpful to me as I launched in this role. We are basically at the beyond the conclusion of the process now, and I'll share up front that it was successful, and something I think all of our trust members really appreciated, and that we benefited from a great deal as a group. So I'll launch with with that pitch, but a bit of background about Amherst and just the realm that we're working in. We are, as most folks in Massachusetts probably know, a college town. As college towns around large state universities in the country go, we're one of the proportionally smallest towns relative to the size of the university in our community, which means we have some pretty specific dynamics that are kind of unique here. We're at this point a council manager, technically a city, although we call ourselves the town of Amherst still. And that's a relatively recent change from 2018. And there is some overlap there with trust context as far as how we emerged and then how we evolved. And so the basic dynamic for those who aren't familiar with the valley out here, is Amherst has a neat little historic downtown and some cool historic neighborhoods relatively proximate to the university, and then some other sort of late 20th century, more familiar suburban development, some multifamily stuff especially from the 80s and 70s. small housing authority, some of those properties. And then we also still are, not far from the woods. There's a lot of protected farmland and conservation area here in Amherst, which means our development context is fairly constrained, especially when we note demand from students, which is quite significant, and that's very much part of the housing story here in Amherst. We kind of uniquely out here in the Connecticut River Valley do have demand for market rate housing, which gets financed and built. It is largely aimed at a student renter population, and then despite fairly positive recent market rate development in that direction, we still have challenges around single family homes getting converted into rentals for students, in part because we haven't quite successfully met that demand. And the longer history there is that though we're building now for a long period of time, much like many communities, we didn't build as much. We did very limited building in the 90s and early 2000s until the past 10 years or so. However, in part due to some stuff that's been in town for many decades, we are in safe harbor as far as the 40B law, meaning that our affordable housing development is essentially in Amherst all proactive on the part of the town. And we do 40Bs, but they're all friendlies. So that's kind of a key development piece to note. Um, so the context of the Amherst Municipal Housing Trust in that development context is that a group of very committed stakeholders in town wanted to be more intentional about creating affordable opportunities in the midst of rising price challenges, which have been happening here in Amherst. Well exceeding this current housing crisis. It goes back, well over a decade, and folks, saw that coming and acted, and organized the trust as a result of that. Amherst has an interesting sort of community political context. There are both folks who are very sensitive to and often opposed to housing. There's also folks who are very vocally supportive of affordable housing. And on the whole, though there is a sort of a always a mixed opinion on market rate development and how to relate to that, and student housing and how we manage that, there is largely, especially among folks who are active, support for affordable development in principle, if not always in practice. So the trust really kind of leverages goodwill that existed in town, to help get some more affordable development done, and sort of keep it on the radar, keep it sort of foremost in folks' minds, and both in the community, but also staff. A big part of what the trust does is kind of nudge staff to be thinking about affordable development. Staffing wise, there have been various consultants over the years, and then until about a year and a half ago, they came up with my job title, and now about half of my part-time job is staffing the trust here in Amherst. And I started that role not long before we started our partnership with MHP. So a bit about what we've achieved so far as a trust and kind of what we had under our belts coming into this planning process. A couple, kind of the most significant thing in a way that the trust has done is actually still underway. There's a former historic school building, which the trust was deeply involved in a disposition process to get that to an affordable developer, and then we later bought an additional lot to go with that. So that's been basically a 10-year process. It is about to receive a comprehensive permit. Hopefully they'll go get some funding and then begin building after that. But the trust really was a key catalyst in making that, for Amherst, fairly complex disposition possible. That was kind of part of how we launched. But alongside that process, we've also completed some other efforts. Most significantly, that's done is a, um, a development of about 28 efficiency units, which are aimed at folks exiting homelessness. That opened in late 23, and it's been incredibly successful. We've supported some habitat and land trust stuff, some different subsidy rentals. And then upcoming along with that other comprehensive permit, we've also got a Commonwealth Builder development, which a developer brought to us, and that'll be 28 affordable home ownership units. So the trust has been, supporting all these things with sort of different tranches of funding at different junctures, and so there was a fairly uh, fairly substantial foundation of our work to build on as we thought about how we grow into the future. And which is kind of what we did with the action planning process with Shelley and MHP. So uh, I think there was a sense in town that we had some momentum in housing, and I think I should say affordable housing there. And I guess members of the trust, I think, wanted to build on that momentum and make sure the trust was a catalyst to continue that momentum. And so that was a big part of reaching out to Shelley and MHP and embarking on a goal making process. Um, and and also I think just to really after about just about 10 years of existence to kind of learn from what had been done so far and kind of ask in a safe way what had been useful and what can we leave behind and what lessons have we learned that we can apply in the future. I'll note that we launched this just about at this point 14 months ago or something like that. And at that point, that in Amherst, all boards and commissions other than our town council have a policy of meeting on Zoom still. And so that was exceptional. And we met in person, which was um, notable, I think, both for the trust and in a way for the town. We had some guests who were excited to see an in-person meeting, which hadn't happened in a while for some of our smaller groups. But that really helped kind of root the effort relationally and get folks excited to see each other. And just, there was something notable about being in a room together, which we don't always get these days. And so I'll really, hold that up. And then our process was, basically from that initial launch with our full trust in person, we created a small working group, which really kind of got into the nitty gritty and move things forward. Um, and then, so basically what that group did was, in conjunction with the larger board, as we looked at what we'd done so far and we started with goals and we drilled into strategies and we made an implementation plan. That piece of the framework was not all that complicated. It's more kind of what happened within that, that I'll, that I really celebrate. um, just kind of ripping through quickly, we came up with a framework of development and funding and education engagement. So I won't read all of these here, but we basically, started, with a goal process, coming up with some top level goals for development funding and community engagement. And then where dialogue really happened was in fleshing out the strategies, within these different goals uh, and
Greg, I
that,
just want to
yeah,
interject that
sure.
you don't have to rush. You can pull
Yep.
out some of the strategies. Do not feel
Sure.
like you have to rush.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds good. So, I'll say, maybe just going back to development here, I think, one of the interesting things to me upon, reflecting on the process, was, the first thing was just, the number 200. 200 is not a number that's rooted in, a very formal data point as far as need in Amherst. It was more a few different conversations with both the small and the large group of, uh, you know, what are we, what have we done so far? What in our wildest but still somewhat realistic dreams, what could we achieve? Do we want to be aspirational or conservative? Questions like that, I think helped trust members, really develop consensus. Um, and there's kind of drilling into some of the strategies, there were sort of more granular versions of that same, kind of dialogue. How many parcels, Is it realistic to expect that we can find that are town owned? We are in an interesting context here with educational institutions. What do we think, we can realistically, you know, enroll them into? And so each of these strategies really got, um, you know, uh, both small group and large group, vetting and consideration, and things got moved around between uh, different goals too, and which at times felt somewhat technical and perhaps a bit, um, I don't know if pedantic is the word, but a bit maybe a bit too in the weeds. But I think overall, some of these more granular conversations we had really strengthened everyone's relationship to the goals and the strategies overall, which I'll get to in a little bit. But um, yeah, so, I mean, I think, there's a lot of, a lot of positive stuff came out, not just of coming up with strategies, but in weighing them against each other, deciding where they landed, in deciding, what's realistic, and also really engaging individual trust members in what they're excited about. That was a key thing. I'll note, in the realm of goal making, it's fun to think about development. It's harder to think about funding, and a little more, a little scarier because, as we know, there's limited, resources for this kind of thing. But we thought hard about it and made, again, a challenging but still somewhat realistic goal, that we think, if our we play our cards right and get a little lucky, we think we can hit this. And I think that both helped us, think about, what are the technical needs we have, and what are the resources we need, and also, I think, to me, this goal, it's a little bit scary, but when I hear trust members out there sharing it, it projects, I think, some bold intentions, which is what I think we need in housing generally, certainly in Amherst. So I'm kind of excited by the zeros on there, so to speak. Um, yeah, and then, I think also too, just going to the education and engagement, and this will, one of the sort of conclusions that I have here is that we really learned, more, just in a technical sense, but I think also in a political or relational sense, of how we fit into the overall town government system and how we can relate better to other town entities, whether it's collaborating with them or more, lovingly, reprimanding them or nudging them, or or asking for their help in the case of the community preservation committee. And I think the education and engagement, concepts we came up with, in part are about, sort of, making strategic engagements with other boards when we need to. And that was, we had a lot of interesting dialogue around that and continue to. um so yeah, so I think the that piece, is separate from the formal or sticks and bricks piece of what we do. But as a sort of cultural and political catalyst in town, this is really important, and I think this frankly satisfies a hunger of that many of our trust members have, to be more than bureaucrats. In Amherst, many folks come from an activist background, and this kind of lets them, you know, express, that part of themselves, through the trust effort. So I'm excited to see where that goes. I will kind of come back around here just to sort of reflect on, what we did and what some of the outputs were besides the goals and the strategies themselves. One of the things that, I think a lot about are just sort of the balance between sort of relationships and process and outcomes. Some of us are relationship people, some of us are process people, some of us are outcomes people. In the trust, we have a lot of folks who are very interested in process. Um, and we were able, I kind of, when this effort started, thought that the small group would do most of the work. There'd be very brief updates to the large group, and then we'd vote on something at the end. It's actually not how it worked at all. The small group would kind of have an initial conversation. The larger group would have perhaps a slightly abbreviated version of the same thing, but much more substantially than just a check-in. And what that meant was that, over time, we were really building consensus around the whole thing in an ongoing way, and you know, and creating a fairly simple goal framework, and then asking, say, okay, so what are the specifics of that goal? Let both the individuals and the whole group really drill into different pieces. Um, so sort of fast forward, what that ended up with was that when we got toward the completion of the goal development process, and as we were moving into an implementation plan, there was a great deal of ownership around the goals and the strategies, and we really have transitioned pretty seamlessly into subcommittees. Actually, we have three different subcommittees around implementation. So there's one for each of the goals, and they are meeting and rolling up their sleeves and doing a lot of um, mm, sort of just much more grunt work, than maybe your average town committee might get into. And I think that's a pretty direct result of letting folks, build consensus over time and weigh in, um, as on these different strategies, over a period of 10 months. Um, so that was, that's a really exciting outcome to me, that, we see people, really feel a lot of ownership, and a lot of just, when we came up with plans for implementation, a lot of eager volunteers for those subcommittees. You don't always get eager volunteers for folks to take on grunt work, but I really do think it was a direct result of, the ongoing consensus process that we had there. Um, I don't have at this point much in the way of complaints as far as how this went. We really voted our final plan just in October, so perhaps if you asked me in a year, I might have more insightful things to say about what we missed. But I'll just note that it would have been ideal that had we had our housing production plan as a town in place before we launched our housing trust strategic planning process. That wasn't possible just based on external circumstances. We're in the midst of our HPP development now, and there has been positive sort of influence of the housing trust plan into the HBP effort, but it probably would have been good to have that up front. Also, just institutional knowledge. We had a fair amount of that with members of the trust, but I was a very new staff member when we started this process, so I didn't have much. Obviously, Shelley did, but Shelley's looking at the whole state and not necessarily just our town. I would have come up perhaps with some administrative goals, things like, anything from note taking to more sophisticated stuff like, a member recruitment strategy, for example, might have been an interesting thing to look at, as part of this. And, you know, I think that is more administrative than output, but so that might be something to think about. Um, we are doing this now in the small groups, but it might have been interesting to prioritize some of those strategies on a time matrix, just so there's more of a shared understanding of, of what should come first within these small groups. And then I would say, and this is kind of a small thing, but when our trust meets on Zoom at 7 p.m. at night. I think looking back, in some cases, we probably should have put um, our action plan discussion toward the front of our agendas when folks were fresh, and recognizing that it's not necessarily a time where efficiency is vital. It's more it's important to make space where folks still have a little bit of juice. And so a few of those I probably would have said, hey, let's not try and anticipate this as a check-in and then have it grow into a 40-minute conversation. Let's just plan on a 40-minute conversation. That's a fairly minor thing, but and I don't think that was a critical obstacle to us, but just a little thought. But yeah, I think that's kind of my quick overview. But I don't know, Shelley, is there anything I should weigh in with more detail on, or how can I?
Yep. So we have
Uh,
some great questions for you. Starting off with the ever-present question of, so we've seen where the trust is hoping to fundraise moving forward, but up to this point, what have been the funding sources for Amherst Trust?
sure. So the lion's share of our funding has come from CPA.
And is that including, do you mind us asking for cover some of your position as a housing coordinator role?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I think starting, I think maybe they broke their ask out when they were still just using consultants, and I think some of those consultants were really just doing meeting minutes and not much else. But then they did make a separate ask for support of my salary. So technically, I'm paid half by the trust and half by the planning department. So
Mhm.
I yeah, that's kind of how that's broken down.
And do you know, can you speak to, just because some people may be wondering, with the CPA funding, has it been an annual contribution? Is it some years? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Since the trust has, yeah, I think maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe 3 or 4 years into the early history of the trust. Since that time, the CPA has been pretty consistently generous with the trust. And Amherst, our CPA is generous on housing overall and has made significant investments in housing, beyond just the trust. So it wasn't so much a heavy lift to get the CPA investment in housing, more about, you know, elevating the trust's role in housing, as part of that priority.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And for with Amherst, like the idea of a culture of support is for affordable housing is actually something that I received years ago
Sure.
from an Amherst activist and who was also on the select board at the time, Connie, and she worked at MHP as well. But that phrase really comes out of Amherst work because folks have been working for a long time. It hasn't just been one development. It wasn't just creating the trust. It actually is
Oh,
a
for sure.
long history of a lot of
Yeah.
boards and even just the trust. So we're going to hear from Marshfield. Marshfield is a brand new trust, whereas Amherst has some experience, and you've been working on things for several years. Um, so we talked about inclusionary zoning some during this
Mhm.
process, and you brought it up a little bit today. Someone is asking you about how successful have you been in reviewing inclusionary zoning with the Board of Appeals or the ZBA? Would love to hear a little bit more about the Amherst experience and your trust experience with inclusionary zoning.
Sure. Yeah. So it's an interesting juncture for inclusionary and Amherst, actually. So the trust is noted in our inclusionary bylaw as the recipient of in lieu fees. In lieu fees are not a automatic option for developers. They have to be approved by the ZBA or the planning board. So recently, we the very first transaction where a developer sought to use an in lieu fee, and was approved for that. So we expect to receive funding from that, probably, oh, 10 months maybe or so, something like that, maybe toward the end of construction season next year. So that kind of got inclusionary more on our radar. Other than being the recipient of in lieu fees, we don't have a formal role in approval of developments, or entitlements, that kind of thing. But I think what the trust members realized was that we're interested in the affordable units that come with inclusionary housing, and so there's an intention, of the trust to be to be a voice, when there are market rate developments with an inclusionary component, and to weigh in on those, both from, and in Amherst, there's interesting stuff with, for example, student apartments tend to get built with larger bedrooms and smaller common areas. And so when we're advocating for inclusionary, we might weigh in and, and pitch for some more family sized or shaped, I should say, units. Um, so we're just kind of we're not there yet where the trust has made uh, played a formal role in like sort of endorsing a market rate development or something like that. But I think individual members of the trust are increasingly trying to weigh in, as those things come before the ZBA or the planning board. Is that?
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
So it might be a little bit early to talk about this, but there's a question about what does engaging with different boards and commissions look like? So that is part of the outreach and some of the one of the goals for the trust. Do you have a sense of what that might look
Sure.
like?
I have an idea. Yeah. I mean, like a good example, is for that that 10-year disposition process, which is about to receive a comprehensive permit. I think we highlighted it as an example of something we might come back to, but we noted that, that project was before separately the Conservation Commission and the ZBA, and there were members of the ZBA advocating for more parking, and there were members of the Conservation Commission advocating for better stormwater wetlands protections, which were basically directions in explicit opposition to each other. In practical, meaning more parking would mean more impervious space, or and working contra to the Conservation Commission's intentions. So our observation is perhaps we can play some sort of educational role in helping those two entities talk to each other. We don't think they were actually aware of their conflicting directions, so trying to kind of, wire separate entities uh, like that so they can communicate a little better. In
Mm,
the case of in other cases too, where we're funding a project, we want to be able to to weigh in when it's before different boards, and and assert that we funded it for a reason. And so I think more recently we weighed in on a housing overlay proposal, which is a zoning thing, but that would presumably produce some inclusionary units, which we support, and we also just think it helps the overall market in town. So I think there's different as different housing policy things come up, we're trying to position ourselves um, to remind that
mhm.
of our goals, so
It's such a great role for a trust to be able to help boards, to help weave the communication between boards.
sure.
So that's such a great example. We have someone asking about the affordable housing development capacity in your area, and if you work with any nonprofit CDCs,
We do.
community
Yeah,
development
yeah.
corporations.
We're pretty lucky, to be, we're relatively, outside of the Boston ecosystem, but we are lucky that we have some great affordable developers in the region. Valley Community Development Corporation built the 28 studios I referenced, and is also building the Commonwealth Builder home ownership project. Wayfinders is more of a regional tax credit developer. Beacon has been here, although the trust has not yet collaborated with Beacon on something. They built something before we were fully up and running. The Community Builders is also in the region, though they've not yet built in Amherst specifically. So there's a few affordable developers out here. Although we do have, a stated intention in our plan. It was kind of our last development objective, is to think about the ecosystem and think about trying to find creative ways to foster a more healthier development ecosystem, drawing new partners in, that kind of things. That's very much an intention.
Hmm. That's great. So I know that there are some people listening, and you might feel a little bit discouraged because Amherst does have particularly a couple really important affordable housing developers that are local to the region.
Mm,
But Amherst has also signaled that they're open for business and partnering with affordable housing developers. Greg brought up Beacon, which is actually a really large for-profit developer. And the trust, I'm pretty sure, was a part of the conversation of preserving units. I'm forgetting
Yep.
what the development is called, but where Beacon came in and purchased a development where
It's
the affordable units were going to expire. And then I think the trust was engaged in that and the CPC stepping in with some funding. So um, you do have some infrastructure, which has been really helpful, but the town has also really signaled that you're and been really proactive in supporting affordable housing. So I think that that also attracts developers because you've like the community builders is not at all based in Western Mass, but they're likely open and interested because there are communities like Amherst that are willing to
for
invest
sure.
in housing.
For sure. Yeah.
Uh, so just don't want people to get overly discouraged because Amherst has also been working on this for a while. So there is a comment about historic districts in Amherst. You brought that up, and someone's wondering how has the relationship been with the Historic Commission? Has it been in a dynamic with some of your affordable housing work or not yet?
In my time here, I have not come across a conflict with the historic district yet. But I would say that our historic district, we have a couple separate ones. There's probably some sites there for that, where our, perhaps Habitat or the local land trust might be able to do something. Probably not too many sites in our historic districts that could facilitate tax credit development, which tends to be, the 20, 25 units or more. So but I would anticipate it if there were a site where we tried to do something that large, it would be a more challenging, effort.
Great. And someone is asking about whether the CPC in Amherst has bonded for housing.
Um,
And do you want to speak
yes,
to that?
yeah, the CPC has bonded, and in fact, they bonded for that preservation effort that Shelley just mentioned, which is a development called Rolling Green, which this was all these transactions were all preceded me, but I'm pretty sure that was either like an expiring Section 8 contract or maybe even just something funkier from the 60s or 70s, that federal programs that were defunct, a long time ago, but where the affordability, window was extended into the, um, you know, relatively recent history. And so yeah, that was I think a win, to, for the CPC to do that.
Yep. So we did talk about that some CPA funds have been used to cover some of Greg's work supporting the trusts. So that is a yes. Um, uh, a question has come in also, another question of whether the trust has experienced any pushback from residents about housing development and concerns that it may put pressure on the infrastructure and increase local taxes.
Sure, it's a great question. And so certainly, the trust kind of, officially, in a very technical sense, is a funding vehicle, and then a lot of the engagement and sort of peripheral work is we kind of layer on top. And so we're, um, y- the short answer is yes. So, we definitely have received pushback. Um, I would say, and by we in this case, I mean we along with our development partners, and it's rare that someone's saying like we don't like the trust. It's more like we don't like this developer that happens to be building something, and it was us that maybe seeded that development. um a great, East Gables is the studio efficiency development. That's a great example. That was, as an affordable development, it was quite contentious. There were definitely folks who were, and this is a development aimed at largely at folks exiting homelessness, or who are, in danger of homelessness. Mostly, ELI, 30% of area median income units, and not entirely vouchers, but a good percentage of them use vouchers. Um, and so and it being Amherst, we have lots of, lots of folks with, lots of letters after their name who can, do, we had folks, doing, statistical regressions of other four developments related to, emergency services calls and all these predictions and how many times the cops were going to be there a week, and all in very, dense academic, inaccessible jargon. And then we also had folks who were vocally very for the project. It definitely wasn't one-sided. An interesting thing there, what really turned the tables, and this is a development that's right next to Amherst College. The college and the immediate neighbors were quite supportive of it. Some of the individual stakeholders within the college who also happened to live in the neighborhood were not, and were public about it. What was interesting was uh, when some Amherst College students started writing letters to the editor of their college newspaper about the actions of their professors is when the vibe seemed to shift a great deal. So yes, we received some pushback, but also a great deal of support. And that just goes to a cultural history in Amherst, of people valuing, sort of, serving low income people, and also, we also have this sort of, the generic NIMBY vibe that most communities experience, but we've found that it's
Mm.
not insurmountable. And I think more recent developments, we're seeing less and less pushback. The two efforts that are kind of in the pipeline now really receive, and they're probably not quite as contentious as a product, but they received virtually no opposition.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg.
Sure.
And Emma and I are, we messaged on Teams that we really appreciate college students stepping up and really
Me
becoming
too.
vocal. And that's just so fantastic
Sure.
because unfortunately they oftentimes get not the most positive view in some of our communities. So thank you so much for all that sharing. And one thing that stands out to me is that we're doing this kind of work around helping trusts create goals and strategies. This process is similar across communities, but there are differences just depending on the community and the makeup of the trustees. And one thing that Greg did bring up is that early on in Amherst, the decision was made to kick off this work together with an in-person meeting. And that was partly, from what I remember, is because they had some new trustees. And then coming off of so many virtual meetings, they just felt like part of it was feeling like they wanted to do some team building of having an in-person meeting, having folks that were new to the trust to be kind of more formally introduced and people learning about each other. And so there was a team building exercise of going around and learning some really interesting things about each other, which was a lot of fun. So that was something that they chose to do that I think helped to set a tone for the work. And I think it helped to people feel connected to the work a little bit. And then, as Greg said, it wasn't just the subcommittee doing all the work, it was bringing it back and then having broader discussions and then the personal experiences of individual trustees and kind of priorities and values were able to help guide the work a little bit as well to help each person feel some ownership. And people were signing up quickly. It was heartening to see. So thank you so much, Greg. We are going to shift to Marshfield. And we have Michael Maresco from the Marshfield Affordable Housing Trust Fund here. And Fred Monaco might be here as well. But we wanted to invite Michael to start sharing about the work of this last year in Marshfield.
Sure. Thank you, Shelley. I am joined by Fred Monaco. He's here with me. He's actually the chair of the trust. I'm the town administrator, and I am on the trust. So first of all, I want to start off by thanking you. You've been fantastic on helping the town. We wanted to make sure that we got off on the right foot, that we were setting the right goals. We didn't want to be overachievers. We wanted to be slow and steady to make sure that we were able to, properly educate our community. And just in the way of background, I just, wanted to give you a little information about the town of Marshfield. We have 93.75% of our housing stock is residential. Right now, we're happy to say that we've got on our housing inventory 10.98% affordable housing. So we've been doing well. And long before we had the Marshfield Housing Partnership, which was the first precursor to the trust, we had the church, local congregational church in Marshfield in 1970, right after 40B went into existence. They developed Winslow 1, which was what we would term in today's standards a friendly 40B. So they did Winslow 1 in 1970, and then 1980 Winslow 2, and then after that, I heard the previous speaker talk about Beacon. We had Beacon here. I was a selectman. They came in town, bought an old drive-in, developed 40B there. And since then, we have Moderna 1, Moderna 2 being built now, another bridle path development for 40Bs in town. None of those are real friendly, but we go through the permitting process with the ZBA, and we've worked to get some of the stuff that we wanted to see in there, but we do have the 40Bs. In 2003, we had the Marshfield Housing Partnership was formed, and the Housing Partnership really started to work and coordinate with the other boards in town about creating affordable housing. I was a selectman at the time who was happy to vote and support that. We had teachers, police, fire, DPW, entry-level employees. They couldn't live in town. Also now, we still have that same issue, but added to that are our kids that have gone off to college, and now they've come back to town. They can't afford to buy a house. My 2 kids live with me right now. They're trying to save money to buy a house. So, it's important that we have quality, affordable housing. And, what I wanted to do is, before we get into the trust and our goals and other things, I wanted Fred to really, Fred was an active member on the Housing Partnership, and to have him talk about some of the things that the Housing Partnership did up until town meeting then approved the trust. And the one thing to mention is that in 2003, when we were trying to create a trust, town meeting said no, they didn't want the trust, or they didn't want an entity like the trust that could build units. They didn't want that. They were fine with educating people about the importance of affordable housing. So they voted it down, and, we've come full retrospect, 20 years later, we now finally have the trust. So Fred, maybe if you could jump in, talk a bit, some of the work that the Housing Partnership did.
Sure. Just to introduce myself, we're fairly new to this community. We moved here 9 years ago from New York. Our 3 kids are through college, and I made the mistake of volunteering. No, really, I got involved my first opportunity was to be part of the partnership because of my background. From my retirement, I worked for state government in New York for 40 years. In the last 18, 20 years, I was involved with housing for the New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. It's a long story, but so I do know housing, but not affordable housing like I did. It's a learning process for me. And the biggest process to learn was that the laws here on housing were so different than New York. And thank God, at the time, the housing coordinator was Jack Mather. Many of you may know, remember Jack, and he really was very great in helping me out. May his soul rest in peace. But that being said, we started out with the program that we started out that I remember used was the MHOP program. And what it was that we would ask applications for help with affordable housing based on an application, based on their income they had to show. And based on the funding we received, we would pick the number we could afford, based on what they wanted. We would judge how many we would pick out of a lottery. And it was an all day, it was like a several hour event on a weekend where we would, talk, go through the gyrations and reports and everything. And that was pretty successful. As Michael mentioned, we're really, we're at 10.8% now. We are with the Madeira 2, which is first project I really worked on when I came here was Madera 1, which has been open for quite a while, and they're building the second phase of that. And we have a few more possibilities in the pipeline that we have that can go, that are, one other one that's approved, but we'll see where we go from there. Let's see, what else can I say, Mike?
I think that was good. I mean, the significance of what the housing partnership was able to achieve, even though I don't want to say Marshfield's anti-affordable housing, but they certainly don't storm town meeting to say we need to create more affordable housing. The housing partnership at that time was able to take existing housing stock and help pay down the cost of that to make it affordable, and then put the preservation restriction on that so that it would remain affordable by putting it, having the deed restriction on it. And we gave, like, I believe for a 3-bedroom was 125,000, 2-bedroom was 75,000, and I think a 1-bedroom was 50,000.
That's right.
And that really got people, into that. And we've had a number of those, and, we continue to monitor those and make sure that the people that are there are still eligible to be there. We just had a meeting last night of the trust, not to cross-populate, but the trust. We had our meeting, and one of our responsibilities is that, we have to send the survey out to the folks, and we've approved the letters to go out, the forms to fill, to make sure that the people that are there still meet the requirements, and we keep those. So, moving fast forward, in 2023, late 2023, we had the housing trust finally passed. Town meeting supported it. I saw this opportunity for the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, had grants available for training and education. We applied, we got one. That was how we got to meet Shelley. Shelley was phenomenal, worked with the historic trust, our historic trust, to really get the housing trust fund moving forward and helping us to identify what our goals and what our strategies were. And if you want, we can share that. We can get into a little discussion about where we are with that.
Yeah, it'd be great if you would talk a little bit about the process and how we came to identify 3 goals. If you would highlight what those goals were and just talk about the process a little bit. Oh, great.
Perfect. So we were able to identify 3 goals. So, we got together, we had, a workshop with Shelley, talked about different areas. What we were concerned about, we didn't want to set goals and strategies that were gonna not be, we wouldn't be able to get them done in a sufficient amount of time. So we were realistic on what we thought we could do. One of the number one components is education, because even after all these years, and Fred can attest to that, is that there's still a misnomer about what affordable housing really is. And, part of that, our citizens have negative connotations about affordable housing, which is a challenge. So education, of course, was one of our number one goals. And as you can see, engage a wide range of residents and at least 2 outreach efforts a year over the next 3 years in an effort to educate local housing needs with the intent to build support for affordable housing. And we did host about a year ago, before we got full-fledged into the trust, we did reach out to housing organizations and had them come. We had the state involved, sort of invited our citizens, and we had 25 residents show up. We're hoping when we do our next one this spring, that we'll have many more people. We will have done better outreach. And then we talked about facilitating an annual joint meeting among key municipal boards. The partnership, as well as the trust, works collaboratively. We get our funding from CPC. Right. CPC funds the creation of affordable housing when we want to do it. They also fund the housing coordinator, Karen Horns, our housing coordinator. They also did that when we had the housing partnership. We also work with planning, and we work with zoning, and we work with conservation. We want to continue to foster those relationships. We work with the housing authority. Before we had the trust, housing authority held our money and they did our lottery, because we weren't able to do that. We also work, sort of not really part of the partnership or not part of the trust, but we did do affordable housing for our veterans and did that project through NeighborWorks. We built a number of units in a building that the town had, and we created that. And the partnership was involved in that a few years ago. And then really our next goal was monitoring, establish a system for annual monitoring of our current and future affordable housing in Marshfield. And that, we wanted to initiate a conversation with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, establishing a South Shore Regional Housing Service Office that Marshfield could contract with for affordable housing monitoring and get into maybe some longer term arrangement. And we want to determine the scope and monitoring services needed in Marshfield. We want to develop a database of housing consultants that could provide monitoring, and then release requests for proposal RFP to solicit affordable housing monitoring services. We hope to get moving on that in the spring. And then the final goal was support, it was the development goal, support the creation of 50 housing units affordable to people earning up to the 80% of the median income over the next 4 years. Identify 1 or 2 municipal sites, which we have. We have a site, and I think, when we were talking with Shelley, we talked about Oak Street in Marshfield, and we also talked about an old 1923 school. Lead feasibility work on 1 or 2 municipal sites, culminating the release of at least 1 RFP. Fund affordable housing development on 1 or 2 municipal sites. Identify local development proposal, including affordable units for housing, and then develop and post a notice of funds available to encourage local development of affordable housing. I'm happy to report that in the economic development bill that was just signed, Chapter 268, we did get $100,000 to do a feasibility study on Oak Street. And that's where we hope to put, up to maybe 50 affordable units on a parcel of land that we have. So we want to begin working on that on January to get a feasibility study done on that. And then with the trust, this is what our proposal looks like. So as we mentioned, we have education, monitoring, and development. 2 of our members each are serving on that, on each of those subcommittees. And then Karen, the housing coordinator, and myself will support all of the 3 subcommittees. We'll work with each of the members to help them achieve their goals. And then, this is a listing of the goals and strategies developed for topics. And then, you can see, and then we have the subcommittees and how they'll work. And then we bring everything back. The subcommittees bring their work back to the committee, just like previously mentioned, and the full board votes on the implementation and work of that. But, we were concerned about how quickly we could get out of the gate, and it worked out well that we were able to get that grant to do the feasibility study, because that will help move us forward on what we hope to be a friendly 40B development. Usually all of these other 40B developments come in, they're private businesses and contractors that work with DHCD or I'm using the wrong name, livable communities to get the housing created. So we'd prefer, the trust would prefer to be in the driver's seat. So this is where we are right now.
Oh, thank you for that. That was great. So given that Marshfield is over 10% on the subsidized housing inventory, but most of those units are through larger 40B developments. And because the town hasn't, outside of the homeownership program, hasn't really done as much community-driven affordable housing development, at least larger kind of rental developments or more moderate size. We did have a conversation early on in our process in the beginning of the year around what might it look like for Marshfield for the trust to help drive some housing development, affordable housing development. And to that, we decided to tour an affordable housing development that was driven by the community in Bridgewater early on in the spring. So MHP reached out to the developer and we scheduled a time to meet for the trust members, Marshfield trust members, to meet in Bridgewater at the development site. So it was a redevelopment of a school, of a surplus school that also has now an addition. So it's been redeveloped into housing with an addition of housing units behind it. So we did that early on to help the Marshfield Trust members kind of imagine what it might look like and what that process might be locally, which helped drive some of the goals, the development goal. Something that's a little bit different than Amherst, but Marshfield's in a really different place where it's a brand new trust board and new trustees moving forward. And so trying to consider different options for the trust. I don't know if there were any other specific questions. Oh, so we will be posting these materials with the video, just so that folks can review it and go through it again, which is perfectly fine. Does anyone have any other questions for Marshfield and the Marshfield process? Let's see any here. How many members do you have on your trust board?
Seven.
7 of you. And then you do have staff support, which is, you said, funded by CPA, correct?
That is correct.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And have
We have
you,
a good relationship with CPC. You know, they were supported when we had the housing partnership, and they're equally supported moving forward with the trust also.
mm-hmm. And is your funding at this point just CPA, or do you have other funding sources for your trust?
Right now, it's the CPA funding that we get. And we got the funding for the 100,000 to do the feasibility. That was from the legislature.
The legislature. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another thing that I'll point out between Amherst and Marshfield is that folks watching, you likely saw that Amherst has a development goal of 200 units and Marshfield is 50. And that is a direct reflection of where the communities are in the process, that Amherst has been working on this community supported housing development longer, at least in terms of larger developments. And so they have a bit more capacity. And with Marshfield, as Michael has said, starting out, we wanted to make sure that the trust was able to identify some measurable goals, but that they felt reasonable for the community and the capacity of the community getting started. And that's important because, you know, you want your trust to be able to stretch, but you don't want to not be able to reach anything and just be discouraged. So it made sense to have a fewer number of units as the goal in Marshfield, just given starting out. And there was a question about monitoring and who does the monitoring in Marshfield. So we should touch on that. One of the goals ended up being monitoring. But I think, Michael, do you want to respond to who's doing your current monitoring?
But right now, we're beginning to do the monitoring ourselves. It used to be done by the housing authority, the Marshfield Housing Authority used to do it for us. So now they wanted to stop doing that, which was one of the reasons that we looked to get into the creation of our own housing trust to be able to do that. So we're working with our housing coordinator. Like I said, the trust meeting last night, we approved the letter and the form that needs to be sent out. Those letters will be going out, you know, probably by next week to get those out to the folks, and so that we can get that data back. And then we'll follow up on the people that don't respond. And we even talked about doing potential site visits if we can't get people to reply.
Right.
So at this point in Marshfield, the units that you're primarily monitoring are the homeownership units through your homeownership program, right? So that's why the monitoring is a little bit different. So most of the units on their subsidized housing inventory are with larger developments where they have the developer or the sponsor has the capacity to do the majority of the monitoring. So part of why we made a goal in Marshfield looking at monitoring is in anticipation, not only of existing units, but kind of in the future, what is a good path forward to make sure that there's solid monitoring capacity in the community. And some of you are likely familiar with the Regional Housing Services Office model in Eastern Massachusetts that the MAPC, which is the regional planning agency in the greater Boston area, has helped establish a couple, and then one of the CDCs has established a third. So there is a conversation happening with MAPC of the possibility of them supporting the creation of one of these offices on the South Shore with some communities, perhaps including Marshfield and other communities, just to build the capacity to be appropriately monitoring affordable housing in that area. So instead of each community having to do it on their own, but having an office with some expertise that can provide those services to different communities. So that's why it made it up to one of the goals in Marshfield. But again, we're encouraging this kind of work with trusts because of years of seeing many affordable housing trust funds really struggling to figure out where to start. The housing needs in all of our communities are very significant. The resources are never enough. And the housing goals that come out of our housing plans are oftentimes pretty general. And they're also goals that go well beyond just the capacity of a volunteer board, like a trust. So we are encouraging communities, trusts, new trusts, as well as existing trusts that maybe haven't done this in the past or haven't done it in a while, to be reviewing the needs in the community, updated data about the housing situation in your community and where the greatest needs are, and then to really focus your trust on establishing a few goals, identifying a few measurable goals that you can really focus on in the next few years, 3 to 5 years, and then coming up with strategies under each goal to help create an action plan, a path forward. So something that can help direct you, guide you, and also something that you can help measure your effectiveness against. It can also help you if you're going before your community preservation committee or just the town or the city trying to receive additional funds, for you to show that you have a path of how you would use the resources, and then to be regularly reviewing them and to be measuring your work against them and modifying them as need be moving forward. So I really appreciate both Amherst and Marshfield for being here today, for sharing some of your experience. Emma has put in the chat that we are accepting applications to do some technical assistance work in this coming year, and the applications we're asking for them for Friday. They're due on Friday. So please reach out to us if you have any questions about that. You can reach out to me directly. And we thank both of these communities for being here. The slides and the video will be posted on the Housing Toolbox. And next week, we have a guest from the Attorney General's office who's going to be digging into open meeting law and what our local boards need to know about open meeting law in Massachusetts. So thank you so much for being here, and we hope that you'll join us again next week.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.